Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be talking about a native plant that can be used as an edible food crop, and I'm talking about the Jerusalem artichoke, Helianthus tuberosus. Alright, so here we have the sunchoke. It's also called the Jerusalem artichoke or the earth apple, and like I said, it is a native plant. It's especially native to more of the central area of North America, and it's a very cold hardy plant, even up to zone 3, I believe. Now here in zone 6A, it grows like a champ. Around here, this plant is also one of the last plants to bloom. I believe it can bloom maybe beginning in September through October, maybe even a little bit into November. But what this does is that not a lot of plants are actually flowering during that time. A lot of plants are either dying up or closing up shop for the winter, so this plant still provides a source of pollination, a source of nectar for various pollinators and insects that may still be in the garden, this late in the season. And these flowers can also be a very gorgeous addition to various bouquets and flower arrangements as well. These sunchokes I bought originally from just a couple of tubers about a year ago. Well, a little bit over a year ago now, just at a grocery store. I believe it was in early to mid-February when I actually purchased them, and I brought them home and I kind of left them out for like a week, and I noticed they were starting to soften up pretty fast, and I didn't want them to rot or spoil. I wanted to be able to plant them in the garden and have them grow. I was a little cautious because I know, in February it can get really cold, wet, you're still getting those snowy conditions. But I went out there and I planted, I think the 3 or 4 tubers that I bought, and I really didn't have very high expectations. I thought they were already going to be soft, they were already going to just not grow. But in April or May, I noticed these shoots coming up, and I'm like, whoa, I think those are sunchokes. And then that year they grew and they got to be really tall, 6-7 feet tall, and were very productive. I was able to freeze a bunch of jars of the tubers in the freezer we have, and I added that to soups throughout the winter, and it was really good. So do not underestimate the powers of the sunchoke when it grows. Even in this soil, it's not that great. There's some clay in here. I put in some compost as well. There's a little bit of topsoil in here, some compost. So yeah, it grows really well. It can be very productive. Just watch out for the voles and the mice. They love the tubers as well, especially later on in the fall when other foods may be starting to run a little bit more scarce, or plants are going dormant. These plants can provide some sustenance for these mice and other such creatures. You can look around the plants. If you have mulch around them or a grassy area around them, just look for like maybe some little vole tunnels going through the grass, and more than likely they'll probably lead right to your sunchoke plants. So just be mindful of that. You could experiment with maybe some companion planting, maybe more aromatic plants, maybe some horseradish around the perimeter of, or near the perimeter of your sunchoke bed. Maybe some other herbs like marigolds or parsley or maybe mint. I've never noticed any huge amount of damage to the plants. The voles and the mice, they need to eat too. They do have their role to play in the ecosystem. But just be cognizant of that. Know that they are out there and they can nibble away at some of your sunchokes. Some of the ones that they do nibble away at a little bit, those are commonly ones I will reserve to like transplant in the garden for next year into other areas, or to replant the bed. So down here I have some honewort. It actually sprouted up on its own. It's somewhat aromatic of a plant. It is in the parsley family. The leaves are edible, by the way. They kind of have a slight celery-like flavor to them, a little bit more on the musty side, but they are really good. I enjoy them. The younger leaves are, of course, the prime edible part. The older leaves get kind of tough. But yeah, it's somewhere between like parsley and celery. But anyway, I'm not sure if these plants, and these plants grow wild around here, but I'm not sure how this might affect the vole and mice, maybe detracting them from the sunchoke patch, maybe not, but I'll have to keep my eye out on that. Even so, it seems to be a very interesting and very intriguing companion to the sunchokes, as this honewort plant, it doesn't seem to mind some shade, and the sunchoke plants get really big and tall and cast a lot of shade. So the honewort seems to grow underneath them quite happily, kind of acts as a bit of a living mulch too. So I'm just kind of letting this spread around the patch to help kind of blanket on top of the sunchokes. And so maybe we'll be able to see how this goes by the end of the season or next season. In other areas of the garden, I also use a grass clipping mulch on top of the sunchokes where the hone wort is not growing, just to help kind of hold the moisture in, help to even out the soil temperature and moisture content. I've also experimented with planting some pole beans in part of that patch to grow up the sunchokes. I have my doubts about it, that it might be a little bit too much shade, too much dense shade for the pole beans to handle, but I figured I'd try a few anyway, see how it worked. And then in other areas of the patch, I also planted in some squash. I believe it was the Cushaw squash variety. I just kind of made a hole in the grass clipping mulch and put a seed in there every so often. So we'll see how that does, acting as a living mulch. Of course, if the sunchokes do cast some shade, the squash has the ability to spread out and find new patches of sunlight, and that has the potential to create a massively productive plot of land where I'm not just getting a lot of sunchoke tubers, because they can really produce a lot, but I could also be getting some really big squash out of that deal too. So it's a very interesting possibility when it comes to trying to use the land as efficiently as possible. You know, of course, with these crops, you know, you want to be mindful of what you're taking from the soil, those nutrients, those minerals, you know, into these plants so that they grow and the food that they produce. So you want to try to continue to add and facilitate the good soil health, even if you are trying to make it as productive as possible. You want it to be sustainable. You don't want the soil to become exhausted and burn itself out, so to speak. So that's also why I add the grass clipping mulch on top. It can be a very nutritionally dense food for some of the microbes and the protozoa in the soil, who help break it down, and these minerals work their way back into the soil and available to the plants. Also, if the beans do work out, they also help to add in some extra nitrogen. You can supplement also with some compost. The sunchokes don't seem to mind a healthy amount of compost, and the squash seems to be pretty cool with it too. You know, with certain other garden plants, you have to be careful because you don't want to like over apply the compost and burn the plants, but sunchokes and squash both seem to be pretty resilient, and I know the squash especially can be a heavy feeder. So kind of like I mentioned earlier in the video, the sunchoke plants are propagated largely by the tubers, kind of like you would a potato. And these can be planted in the garden. They're not too picky, other than they like full sun. The soil doesn't have to be that great. It can be somewhat poor. So the tuber is the predominant aspect of propagation. You may be able to grow them from seed as well. I did collect some seed last season, and I was going to plant it early this spring to kind of see how they grew, and if they grew, if it really worked. They probably need to be stratified, or you just plant them really early in the spring or late in the fall. Of course, in the fall would be when the seeds would naturally fall on the ground and, you know, be dormant over those winter months to help to stratify them, and then they'd sprout up in the spring. It's not a very popular method. It's probably not the most reliable. And it may take a year or two or even more until you get like a decent crop of tubers, because you know, you're starting a whole new plant. You're not just taking, you know, a tuber from an already established plant where it can just sprout up the next year and it has all these starchy reserves. You know, these are seeds that are starting out as fresh new plants, so they may take a little bit more time to develop. If you're using the propagation by tubers, the tubers can be planted anywhere from the fall throughout the winter into the early spring, so they seem to survive in the soil pretty well. In terms of edibility, the tubers, of course, you can grate them up raw into salads, you can nibble on them raw, you can cook them up into soups, maybe as a potato substitute. They do have a little bit of a different flavor. They're a little sweeter than a potato, maybe a little softer too, but they're really delicious, really good. Hopefully in the future I'll be able to experiment more with using them in the kitchen. You can store them right in the soil. Just be mindful of the voles, and even in the harsh winter conditions, it can be, you know, it could be challenging to dig. You know, when the ground is frozen, maybe there's snow on the ground. That's why I like to gently chop up the tubers and put them in jars and just store them in the freezer for easy access throughout the winter. So yeah, the sunchoke, very productive, very useful plant you can have in the garden, and especially for me trying to transition this garden into more of a perennial inclusive, hopefully maybe even perennial dominant garden someday, these provide a very promising opportunity, because even when you do harvest a bunch of the roots and stuff, there are usually always some that stay in the soil that you don't find, and they'll sprout up next season. You can propagate them really fast, really easily. They really don't take a lot of work to grow. So I hope you enjoyed this video on the Sunchoke or the Jerusalem artichoke. Maybe it's a plant you might want to add to your garden. It can be a plant that's easy to grow even in some adverse conditions. And even then, it can be a very highly productive plant. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to catching you in the next video.